Awesome. We're now recording and talking about DOM events, and we're talking about, hey, this command line tool curl, it makes a request. We get an HTML page. We see the text here. If I want to, I can pipe it into a file. And now if I look at that file, it's that text, right? And I'm not sure if that's in the same directory here. Otherwise, I would show it in VS Code. So I can, yeah, let's copy Google.html and we'll move it to, it must be code or Sierra demos and notes. And this is the path that the directory I just made lives in. And we'll put it there. And now if I go over here, I see the file I copied, and it's not formatted very nicely, but it's an HTML document. So kind of where I'm going with this is that the same is true with all these websites. If I do curl https nytimes.com, that was interesting. I would have expected let's try http at newyorktimes.com. I will be honest, that should have worked. I'm not sure why it didn't. There we go. So we have a monstrously big HTML file. And if we use DevTools, we can go to this sources tab and we can see the index.html. And again, we have all this text. And the context here is the browser gets all this text when the browser makes the request to the New York Times server and the New York Times server sends back this HTML page. How does the browser turn that text into the stuff that we see on the screen? It's not just displaying a text file to us. It's got to do a whole bunch of work. So the first thing it does is it parses that HTML document exactly like we parsed that CSV file in our Python code, and it created a bunch of objects. I'm not sure actually what language a browser is written in, and I'm not sure what language a browser uses. It looks like Chrome is written in C++. C++ is also an object-oriented language, so we're doing the same thing we've done with Python with C++. And it creates a tree data structure. And they have a bunch of classes. There's probably a document class. And all of this is the document object model. And that's what the browser uses when it renders data and does all this stuff. And then the JavaScript that we run here in the browser, sorry, let me clear all this stuff, lets us interact with that, right? If I write some code here, this document JavaScript object, that's like if in our Python code, we had imported a class named document, except the browser has already set all this stuff up, and we can get all sorts of interesting information out of here, such as document.getElementById. And I don't know what elements have what IDs. So let's find a good ID somewhere. Here's a good one. Yeah, what's up?
No, then you found one.
I'm sorry?
You found an ID, so I was just calling it out.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. Let's try this site-content and see what happens. And this is the browser console does some nice stuff for us. If I console log, and again, the browser console gives us amazing auto completion to help figure stuff out. And I think I was missing a second parentheses. So let's try this again. Yeah, so it's hard to see exactly the string representation, but we could get that as well. And what's going on here too is that the browser is this C++ running program, a C++ program that's running essentially, right? The browser is written in C++. Part of what it has inside it is the JavaScript engine and this console. And this is all running inside this other C++ program. And then the browser gives us an interface, an application programming interface, an API to interact with the document object, the DOM API. And I'm going to borrow a bit of language from the Mozilla WebDocs site, because again, they do a very good job. It's the data representation of the objects that make up the structure and content of a document, of an HTML document. It's a programming interface for web documents. It's like, again, think about if you created a class in Python that had tons of methods that let you interact with an HTML page in all sorts of ways. That is what someone has gone ahead and done in JavaScript for us to interact with this DOM running in the browser. And there's all sorts of interesting things. Like this is a great example. And so application interfaces, there's tons of DOM methods. Like I'm wondering if we can find DOM API spec. Yeah, I don't even know if I can find the full spec and the full list of methods, but it wouldn't be useful because there would be so many. So it's sort of like, again, based around what are we trying to accomplish? And this is a great example, actually, to go back to the New York Times site. And I apologize for that message. So the document object that the browser has imported and set up for us in this JavaScript that we're running in the browser, an instance of a class, has a method, query selector all. It will select all nodes in our tree, all HTML elements that are paragraph tags. And there's a lot of them. And it puts it in a list, exactly like we've done with CSS when we import it and we're building lists out of that data in our Python programs. And then if I want to do things, yeah, I have this variable paragraphs. And I think I might have to leave the New York Times website soon because this is, the messages are getting to be really annoying and making it a little hard to see what's going on. But it's an array, or in Python, a list, right? And we can see all these paragraph tags. And what we've done is the DOM is a tree data structure. And we had this method that searched through the tree and found all the nodes that were of the type of a paragraph tag. And this is, I think, where I should also find a good, I have a couple good diagrams that I want to share. This is another good one to kind of connect these dots again. And Kayla, like you were saying before too, the HTML text file gives us a really nice visual representation of the tree. Right, so when the browser parses an HTML file, it builds a tree data structure that looks like this, and each element is a node in that tree. So let me pause and check in here with folks, because I've been doing a lot of talking and I've only shown a little bit of code, and I want to see, how do people feel about this? Does this make sense? Do people have questions? And you should have questions because this covers a lot of ground. And the browser is, I think, a really its complexity is not always first appreciated or understood. And it's also pretty cool. And also I'm curious too, like, would people like to see more code examples? Like, I want to check in to see how people are feeling about the concepts and what's on people's minds. Matt, yes, sir.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but is this the same root element that we're going to be dealing with in React?
Great question. No. The short answer is React itself creates another tree of React components, and we'll pick some HTML element that will be the root of that other tree. Root is just a general term for the first node in a tree. Like, to be honest, I don't think this document here is really necessarily part of the tree proper. That's maybe just sort of how we access it. And to kind of connect all this stuff, I know I've shown this before, but our file system where directories and stuff live is also a tree. And that's where you see the term root as well, and where the term root comes from. That's a pretty terrible image. Let me find a better one. Yeah, that one's better. So I apologize, this is a bit blurry, but the root of the file system tree, the / the root directory, right? And in fact, if I go here, whether it's here, it doesn't matter which terminal I use. I can do this in VS Code as well, because they all do the same thing. I can go to the root directory of the whole file system. Right, if I type print working directory, we just see root because we're at the very top of the tree, as opposed to if I navigate to my home directory. And some of you may have seen or heard jokes about, like, this is the thing you never ever want to do, because this would delete the entire file system, remove recursively, getting rid of all the other directories and overriding any checks. I'm not sure if the Mac will even let me do that, because that's such a bad idea to do. On a Linux machine, you can do that and really mess your life up. Yeah, so that's a great question. And that term root is a general term used to talk about trees. What else is on people's minds? How are people feeling about the basic concept of, like, what the document object model is and its relationship to an HTML file? Can someone maybe just walk us through that again?
Is it safe to say that the DOM is like the liaison or the translator between the front-end languages and the back-end languages?
That's a great question. The DOM is like the liaison between an HTML file and the user. And it's a liaison between an HTML file and our JavaScript code. Because the DOM really doesn't know anything about a web server or programming languages running on the server. All the DOM knows, to go back to the network tab, and in fact, this is going to be hard to do, but I think maybe, let's see if I can find what I'm looking for. Yeah, so this is an interesting wiki that has a lot of interesting tech stuff.
A standardized way to deliver information, and it's a standard that everybody writes to?
That's a great question. With regards to browsers, yes. Let me just maybe use Wikipedia as an example. Like, CSV is sort of a good example of this. Like, CSV is a standard. So if you're writing code that's going to read from a CSV file, then you kind of know what to expect. And HTML is a standard. So I apologize, with real world stuff, there's always a lot of pages and stuff that gets loaded. But just to walk through again, what a browser does is I have this URL in here. I hit enter. The browser on my computer makes a request over the internet to the cloud or wherever Wikipedia's server lives. The Wikipedia server sends back a bunch of text that happens to be in the format of an HTML document. And we can do this exact same thing with this curl command, which is making that same HTTP request that that browser does when I put that same URL bar in the address bar and hit enter. But here we're doing it from the command line and not with a tool that has a graphical user interface, right? The browser has a graphical user interface. This does not. And we get back a ton of text. And again, I can run this command and I'll just put it in an HTML file. Oh, I goofed. Read-only file system. I'm not sure.
You do the command with sudo?
Yeah, I shouldn't have to. I'm not sure why. It might be the word, it might be the. Oh, because I'm at the root directory of the whole project. In fact, let me go ahead and let me do it here, which is nice. Like the Mac doesn't let me really do something weird and silly in the root directory because it's so important. So again, I'm going to this path, right, where these files live. And let me try this again, curl. So that works. And let's try using this pipe command to stick all that HTML into a file. There we go. And we got a little bit of output. And if I go over here, I've got, so this is what the browser on my computer gets from the Wikipedia server. Right here. It then goes and grabs a bunch of other stuff. Like as the browser reads through this, it says, oh, here's a link. Here's the URL to where that link lives. Let me ask the server for that too. And then we see all that stuff happen here. But this first step is the most critical one. Jim, yes, sir.
I've heard it said that the page doesn't precisely exist on the server, and that when you click on a link, it goes out and you make a request back to the server and it constructs the page and sends it to you.
That is how most modern websites work, and we'll see that with Django, correct. Back in the day, the original form, and for teaching purposes now, is you could imagine the entire HTML page being written already and living as a file on the server that our browser would request and the server would send back. But you're absolutely right. That's how modern, almost all modern websites and web apps work. Not all, but many. To take this with the DOM, again, what I want to emphasize is the browser gets a bunch of text, essentially. And this is all happening on the front end. To go back to your question as well, Icarus, like the browser talks to the server sends this HTML file over, and then the browser says, what do I do with this? Well, I have to turn this text into something that I, as a computer browser piece of software, can understand. And so just like we wrote those lines of code to parse a CSV file, someone has written some parsing code to parse an HTML file, and it turns it into a tree that lives in memory in the browser on my computer. And again, Icarus, you made a really good analogy then. The DOM is then the interface that the browser gives us if we want to write JavaScript to, and this JavaScript is running again on my computer as the user. You can get all sorts of interesting things, right, with the document object model, including what our current URL is. And in fact, I think if I change that, yeah, so that JavaScript that I just ran, that is all, again, on my computer on the front end in the browser, but I can use it to drive the browser, to control the browser. It's the interface for doing that. And similarly, when it's time for the browser to show me, the user, the Wikipedia page or NewYorkTimes.com, it's gotta do whatever stuff computer graphics programs do and render that information. So it will use the DOM for that as well. It's the interface that the browser uses to interact with our document, and document sort of being the word we're using here to talk about all this data on the HTML page. Does that make a bit more sense to folks? And I'm curious what questions people have, because this is like a very big new concept and we really haven't seen this before. Like we're starting to really see how a lot of programming is about working with these other very sophisticated programs that other people have written that we then leverage when we write code. So this is a great time to ask questions. Like this is definitely, we're, you know, learning, this is learning prime. This is learning prime. It's not like until you start doing programming and computer science stuff, there's not a lot of like things similar to the document object model that we would run into and have prior experience with. Jim, yes, sir. Oh, Gabo, yes, sir.
Hey, I guess for me, I have what is kind of an understanding of the DOM, I think,
Yep.
and I understand the commands are doing, but I guess I'm missing like I guess the practical application for us doing that.
Yeah.
Why would I do this?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think now is probably a good time to make that transition and start taking a look at that. Before I kind of switch gears and we start looking at sort of how we can use the document object model to write front-end code that is more interactive. Are there other questions that people have about sort of the core concept of the DOM or parts of it that it would be good for us to walk through again? And does anyone want to maybe take a crack at giving like a high-level explanation of it, essentially kind of walking through and repeating what I was just saying?
Just so I'm gonna try to repeat try
Yeah,
to recite
please.
what you mentioned. So if this was the interface, so DOM is basically the API we're using just to like translate everything.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I really think the way to think about it is imagine that you're writing Python and someone says, we need to write a web browser from scratch in Python. And you're creating a class. And when you create a new instance of that class, you are going to pass it an HTML file. And just like we had to parse that CSV file and get the data out of it, we have to parse the HTML file and get the data out of it. And then we have to have a bunch of methods so that I can render an image, or so that I can render an H1 tag properly, or so that I can interact with CSS, or so that if I need to, I can grab a specific element. And it would be a pretty huge Python class, right? And in reality, maybe it would be multiple classes, maybe it would be one, but that's exactly what the DOM is, and that's the interface. And then we're using that class in other parts of our browser program, or in this case with our JavaScript code.
All right. So essentially, this looks like a web crawler.
That's a great point. Web crawlers interact with the document object model, and that's how they use the document. Yes, exactly. Like there's a lot of overlap between what a web crawler does and a web browser does, because a web crawler like looks over an HTML file and grabs data out of it for search engine optimization or to get data out of it. Or like if I want to suck up 1,000 Wikipedia pages and find all references to cats for some particular reason as a researcher, then I would use something called a web crawler to do that, or a scraper. And in that vein, I think let's start looking at some practical applications, and that will help a lot too with, I think, as always, like it's a balance between talking about concepts and application. So let me quickly put together a little bit of HTML, and then we can write some JavaScript and talk about what's going on. You know what, we're not even going to worry about the button on click yet. And div. I'm going to use live server. And we're just going to even poke around with this in the browser for a minute, and then we'll maybe add some JavaScript code to our file. So I have an input element. So the core question of why do I care about the DOM is, well, websites are a lot more interesting when they're interactive, when I can type my name, and if I hit the submit button, something happens. The only way that web browsers do anything interactive is with JavaScript, really. Whenever you see any sort of like animation or interaction, like something happens when you click on a button, even this autocomplete stuff, these days it's usually JavaScript. A lot of baked in browser behaviors implemented with JavaScript, and everything we'll do is with JavaScript as well. So our task is, we want to not just have a static website that just shows information about cats. We want to have some stuff happen when the user clicks on stuff. Eventually what's going to happen is I enter my name, I hit submit, and our browser will send that information over the internet to our server. Our server running Django, a Python web framework, will save my name to a database and create a new user account. Our web server will send a message back to our browser saying user account created, and then our code running in the front end in the browser will receive that message and display to the user and say, hey, Adam, you have a new account, congratulations. Exactly kind of actually like what was just happening with signing up on GitHub Classroom in a lot of ways. But step one of that is we have to grab this information from this input element, and we have to know when this button is clicked, and that's where the DOM starts to come in. Let's see, what was the name of the button? It was, oh, the button doesn't have an ID. That would be a problem. I don't think I gave the button an ID. Let's give it an ID of just the button. So we can get that button. What's a bit more interesting and what the DOM gives us is just like when you were going through the bank accounts problem, maybe, and you had like a customer, and then you created a class instance or for an account, you could do stuff with that instance of your account method. And the DOM gives us a lot of built-in methods as well. Like when I get this button instance, it has a lot of built-in methods. Just like the way if we created a class, I could call methods on my class. Oh, it's not a function. It's a property. So this is not a method on a class. This is a class variable. Let's see if that, yep, okay. I have to clean it up a little more. And I will use a function expression because I think it makes it a little clearer. We haven't looked at JavaScript in a minute. But here's kind of where I wanted to go. Like I keep hitting this and now something gets printed out. And to kind of jump over here and I'll write this out and then we can talk about it. So we can make it a little easier because in our HTML, we know that the browser uses the document object model to interpret and parse this just the same way that in a CSV file, you know, if we give a name to the first column, the second column, and so on, we know what that stuff is going to be. And this is really
You got a
ugly.
typo in the on click.
Oh yeah, that's like the lollipop commercial. Let's see here. Missing identifier expected JavaScript. What is it not? Let's see if that. This I may have been overly ambitious in doing it that way. If that doesn't work, we'll do it the other way. Function statements require a function name. We will make it an arrow method and see if that works. And then if it doesn't, we'll just use a script tag. So we're jumping way back in time here, like the million years of like 2 weeks ago with the JavaScript arrow method. But this is an arrow method. And actually just as a very quick refresher, let me, oh, come on, terminal. There we go. If I run node, this, let me clear it so it's a bit easier to read. This is an arrow function rather not an arrow method. And then if I do say hello, we call that function and print hello. And so I am just defining this JavaScript inline right here because HTML has sort of become designed for us to add some JavaScript on. And the document object model is what binds everything together. Kind of like the force in Star Wars or the self keyword for Python classes. And if this works and I didn't get anything wrong, which it looks like I did. And then this is the other challenge with this stuff, honestly, is that the debugging gets a little funnier. Let's see. Yeah, and I might end up doing this the other way if, yeah, it's a little funny that I don't have to wrap it in an arrow function when I do it this way. But so what we've got is the document object model lets us write JavaScript that interacts with our HTML. And to make this a little more interesting and a little easier to read too, to be honest, I'm going to use a script tag. I'm going to write a function. And then over here, instead of defining this in that one line, we pass it the name of the function. And what the document object model does is take care of that when this button is clicked on. It says hello. And that is what always annoys me, is remembering exactly how that works. Kenneth, so that's a great question about JavaScript in a JavaScript file versus not, versus in an HTML file. So what we can also do is we could let's create a different method here. Let's use, can someone remind me, how do I import a JavaScript file and use it in an HTML file? Is it with a script tag or a link tag?
Scripts.
Yeah. Thank you. We can have the HTML file load the JavaScript file. And we get access to that method. So to answer your question, Kenneth, the DOM, so whether we write the JavaScript in a JavaScript file or sort of inline here in the HTML file, when the browser reads through the HTML file and the JavaScript files, it kind of bundles it up all into the same thing. And then the DOM is what lets the JavaScript interact with the document, right? The HTML document. And then where this starts to get a little more interesting is if I want to do a bit more work. And this may be something we may want to spend a bit more time in the afternoon talking about the DOM, because there are a couple parts of how it works that we haven't touched on yet. But I think it is really helpful to kind of go over some of these fundamentals, because it is a lot of moving parts.
Adam, can you tell us, so when you start your computer, there's the boot sequence and it looks for certain files, and if they're there, the system starts. If I visit a domain name and there is a index.html file there, it will process that. What does this index.js do the same thing? Is that always just pre-loaded if it exists in that location?
That is a great question. And in fact, let's look at, and in fact, what let me put up here console.log. That's actually a really great question, Jim.
And then my question would be, is there an example you could show that when you start your browser and it processes, and this is probably how a virus is written, I bet, when your browser starts and you process that index.js, can you show it, print something to the screen, or
exactly,
or do something locally?
Yeah, let's do that right now. So, and this is where the refresh or hard refresh button is really great, because it gets rid of, like, the browser will also cache stuff. So we're going to empty cache and hard reload. This should have finished. We loaded index.html. Did live server get in the way? It took a minute. Yeah, live server is getting in the way with a little bit of funniness. That's what this WebSocket thing is. But, oops, sorry. The first thing the browser did was request index.html, because that's what we're asking for here in the URL from this location, from this path at this IP address that happens to be the same computer that the browser's on, but it could be your computer, Jim, or anyone else's computer on the internet. The browser reads through index.html. Right, then we can see it's parsing this text. It goes through it one line at a time. It's here, it's here, it's here, it's doing stuff, it's building the tree. It gets here, it says, oh, this is a script tag with the source attribute. Server, please give me this file, index.js. Server sends back an HTTP response with, again, just the raw text of that file. And then the browser starts reading it. And because it knows it's JavaScript, it also starts executing it. And we see that right here where this gets printed out every time I refresh the page. And I think that's kind of what that flow that you were asking to see of what's happening when a browser loads an HTML page and is loading a JavaScript asset from that and then like running that JavaScript. Is that helpful?
And then can you show it being sent to the window, the current browser window?
Show what being sent to the current browser window.
The text you just wrote, instead of being in the console, how do you write it to the
Oh,
window?
in the console. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So JavaScript cannot directly access the browser window. JavaScript has to manipulate the DOM in order to do that. And actually, this is a great chance to show that. I will just do it here. Let's do this, document.get element by ID. We're going to grab this paragraph tag. Which has the ID of value. Or which has the ID of output, sorry. And we are going to set it to, and I have to Google this really quickly. JavaScript get element by ID and set the value. It is the dot value property. Every DOM node, pretty much anywhere, should have a value property. And if I did this right, we can actually watch this happen when we reload our page. So I did something wrong. Cannot set properties of value. And this gets into some interesting stuff. What did I do wrong here? Does anyone have any guesses? And let me actually show how to debug this. The first thing you want to do when you're debugging, because front-end debugging is a whole universe because it's got a lot of interacting parts, just start printing stuff to the JavaScript console. So let's see what this is.
Can we just set p
It's
tag
null.
to, in your JavaScript file, you're setting p tag as if we were trying to set a variable like we do in Python. Does that matter here? To where you're saying
That
like
does
p
not
tag
matter
equal?
here. Yeah, yeah, let me show you. So let's walk through what this program is doing, and I'll be the browser. The browser reads this line 1. We have an HTML file. It's going to start parsing it and building a document object model, building the DOM tree. It reads here, browser's here, HTML stuff. Cool. I'm setting some browser settings about screen size and resolution. We've got a new node in the tree named title. Oh, this is a script tag with a source, index.js. Server, please give me this JavaScript code. And now I, the browser, will start reading and executing it. I'm going to go over here. I console log, I print the browser is now parsing index.js, and we saw that here. I define a function, awesome. I get an element by ID output. Let me look at my DOM tree. I have only gotten this far in building the DOM tree when this JavaScript code is running. The browser hasn't even gotten to this point of the script tag. And that's why when we console log this, it's null. And this is a very common gotcha. And I remember on day one, someone correctly pointing out, you probably don't want to run the script tag there. There are two ways to do it. One is you could put this somewhere at the bottom, which should work. Yep. And well, actually, is that working? Well, it's sort of working. We get this printed out. This is the other good way to debug stuff in the console is document get element by ID output value equals new. So there's something that I did not do right there. Maybe it's like inner HTML. Yeah. So that's what I did wrong. Is there's a couple different properties of DOM nodes, and I thought it was value that would change the actual text, but it's actually we need to change what's inside this paragraph tag, right? The inner HTML between the opening and the closing tags. So if I go and change this here, and let's make this something different, just so we know that it changes when I refresh the page properly. And it lo and behold, it happened very quickly.
Adam, can you go back and show how it was parsing through? Can you show the HTML structure one more time? So
Yeah,
you got down to line, whatever you got. No,
Yeah.
on the very top there, when you,
Yeah,
oh,
it was
okay.
like right here.
When you call the JavaScript file, whatever you do that, does a JavaScript file have the latitude to send you back up the tree and never go any further?
Great question. Great question. Not exactly, but what you can do is this. On content loaded. And this actually touches on something that is really good to talk about. Which, because it's lunch, to be honest, I think we will probably want to gather the class for 30 minutes at either 1 or 1:30. The other piece of the document object model is something called an event. We didn't really talk about it here, but if I'm, again, think about you're writing a Python program. Here with this button, we have this property on click, and when the button is clicked, stuff happens, right? And let me see if I can find something happens. So what happens when the button is clicked? And how does the rest of the browser know that the button has been clicked? What the document object model also has is it uses something called events. And this is one of those concepts that you'll see all over the place in programming and computer science. When I click this button, it creates a tiny little object called an event. That event has an ID. It has a value that points to this button. And we can also create what are called listeners for events. And the DOM does a lot of this work for us. And the way that we do it here, we say, hey, DOM, create a listener for this button. When there's a click event, call this function. Very similarly, events fire for all sorts of interesting things, and that's kind of how the DOM communicates with the browser and with JavaScript. Ooh, I apologize. And JavaScript has a method called add event listener. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm just going to copy all of this and we can use it and talk about it. Actually, we'll just copy that one. And so I actually am not 100% on the difference between window versus documents. I think this Stack Overflow post probably has it right. Like, we have a JavaScript window object that includes the document object. And we can confirm this by going over here somewhere to when I find the right one. In the console. So if I do this on my computer, if I'm running just Node, if I'm running JavaScript outside the browser, there is no window object. What happens is when the browser is running this JavaScript engine, it creates this window object and gives it to us. We have all sorts of things. The entire browser history is there. I'm only on the same page, so it doesn't do anything interesting. We also have the document, the whole DOM right there. And so that's what we're doing here. We're saying for the whole browser, add a listener. The browser, once it finishes loading our HTML page, essentially, will fire off an event. And the name of that event is DOM content loaded. Like, you have finished parsing the very last line of that CSV file and it's all done. And now you're like firing off a print statement or something. We finished parsing the HTML file and it's all done. And then what we have here is a callback, an arrow function, a function that gets called when this event fires. And let's see if this works. First off, it looks like I have a type error on line 7 here because I'm running into the same problem. Right, and so in fact, let's put all this over here just to get rid of that error. And it looks like there may be something else that I'm missing, but we will figure that out shortly. So actually, that worked. And let's put this stuff up here. And let's say before DOM content loaded, paragraph tag is that. And now we should see null and then our message. Yeah. So Jim, to answer your question about kind of how to handle controlling those events and stuff, and this is a whole new world too, by the way, folks. Like, the world of like a sort of an event model is something we haven't seen yet. It's one of those big concepts that kind of sits alongside object-oriented programming. So we'll keep talking about it more and more. But to answer your question of JavaScript kind of driving the browser and stuff, we don't want to change how the browser parses HTML. That's such a core fundamental feature of how like a browser works and functions. Instead, what we want to do is leverage the document object model and have it tell us when a good time to run our JavaScript is. And the way that we can talk to the DOM and find stuff out about it and interact with it is also through events and having things listen for events. So this is probably a really good time to check in and see what questions people have, because this covers a lot of ground as well. There's a lot of concepts bundled up in here. This is like learning squared right now. You know, we're talking about like the idea of an event and an event listener and an event system, and that's like a whole nother architecture. So I'm really curious what people are thinking and what's on people's minds.
I've got one question on line 8 with the that event tag over toward the end. Is that like a built-in keyword there, or is that something you can input yourself if you go all the way to the right before the arrow where it says event right there?
Great question. Yeah. So if I have a JavaScript arrow function, I can pass it an argument. Right, that is just an argument to the function. And actually we can console log that because the DOM creates that and we can get all sorts of interesting information from there. And if I refresh the page again, like an event has all sorts of information, most of which is not relevant. Really the most relevant one is this event.target.value. Target is the name of like, where does this event come from, right? Because potentially more than one thing could create an event of type DOM content loaded. Though this particular event is a little unique. Where it really gets interesting is with the input field. And let's see here, get element by name. Yeah, we might circle back to that one after lunch, but that's the short answer, that's a function argument right there. And I guess actually the value is undefined. Like, and to kind of close the loop on the example, you know, if I do this, that argument is passed in. This is a bit more interesting, like the on-click handler is a good example. And that one I think I can show us really quickly before we break. So a click event is also an event. So let's see how we can do this. Let's see if this works. And then I think we should break for lunch and we'll probably continue this after lunch. Yeah, so I don't have to create a listener for this click event in my JavaScript code because the browser, when it's parsing the HTML and it sees this on click attribute here, will go ahead and do that for me. And then when I click on this button, the document object model says, hey, this button has been clicked. I should create a click event for that button. And we'll talk a bit more about how events get to their listeners after lunch. But then what happens is the way that the browser works, make sure that this event, when it's created, is heard by our code that is listening for it. And the event has information about where it came from. Like if let's see here, if I do maybe event target value, if that's more interesting. Maybe inner. Yeah. So this is interesting. This inner HTML property on a DOM node gives us the text of that button. Because again, the button is an element, right? And it's got some content, this stuff in the center. And we've turned that into a node, a button node in our DOM tree. And there's some inner.html for that. Like, and in fact, right here, if I change this, and then I go here and I click the button, that's one of the nice things about this event system is an event can carry all sorts of information. Someone mentioned like kind of drinking from the fire hose and playing 4D catch chess. I agree. It is a lot of moving parts. And I think some diagrams can help too, and maybe we should draw some after lunch. We should definitely do some kind of review today. And let me actually stop sharing my screen and then we can chat a bit, and also that way I can check the calendar.